So, kia ora koutou, welcome everyone. It's right on 7 o'clock. So I'll get started with some general introductions. The important stuff will come a little bit later, so people that come in a few minutes late shouldn't miss too much. So my name's Amon Martin. I'm actually the asset planning manager at TCDC. I've been there for a few years, coming up 5 years, but I've been leading this project for just about 3 years. So it really started back in 2019. It's been an interesting process and pretty comprehensive. So I'll be presenting today, but we'll also have Connie Buchanan facilitating some of the questions. So welcome, Connie.
Hi, everyone.
And so feel free, the way we're going to work the questions is if you add your questions into the chat, there'll be times during the presentation where I'll go back to Connie and she'll read out the questions and I'll do the best I can to answer the questions. We're also after feedback. Probably the feedback can be provided throughout the meeting, and when we come to pathways, probably halfway through the presentation, definitely looking for feedback on those things. That's where we're making decisions, looking at solutions. So definitely want that feedback. Also with us, we've got a couple more people. Sian John, she's leading the project from the consultant side. So welcome, Sian.
Hi.
Kia ora, and we've got Rick Leifting. He's from Waikato Regional Council, and he'll be presenting a couple of aspects relating to flood protection that they provide.
Kia ora.
Kia ora. So that's introductions, and really tonight we're wanting to give an overview. Just make sure I'm on the right slide. Actually, I've gone one ahead. So the purpose tonight is make sure there's an awareness of the project. And we've probably had 5 consultation events that have been in Thames or Tararu that pick up the Tararu aspects. But we believe there's probably people here tonight or people still not aware of the challenges in the project, what the project's doing to try and help with those challenges. And secondly, we want to get feedback, like I mentioned, not just feedback on the chat, but there's a couple of other ways to provide feedback we'll talk about at the end of the presentation. The things we're going to focus on is the Shoreline Management Plan overview. So just a snapshot in terms of how this Tararu fits into the larger project. Then we're going to talk about Tararu specific details, and then lastly about how we provide feedback. So why a shoreline management plan? It's largely because of, well, a big part of the need for a shoreline management plan is the existing hazards, the existing flood events and the coastal erosion events that we are seeing periodically. So these photos pick up issues around the district that happen now that aren't affected by any sea level rise or climate change, but those are challenges that we're having to work with right now. But it's also not just about right now, and it is about looking to the future. So how we're doing it, we're following the Ministry for the Environment process that they've set out. The first part of that is quite technical in terms of understanding what is happening. So doing the flood hazard assessments, looking at the coastal erosion, but then seeing what's actually behind those assessments, what's at risk, what people value, what's important, and then we come to options and pathways, and then recognising it's not just a single option, but it's options over time that we have to think about, and that is really the pathways approach with triggers and thresholds. So that's how we kind of do it. Who's involved? Quite a lot of different aspects to who's involved. We've got Waikato Regional Council. They're supporting the project team or part of the project team, and definitely providing a lot of expertise from a technical perspective. Waka Kotahi's in the technical team as well, and that team, alongside the consultants, deliver or work through a lot of the technical aspects. But the technical aspects are only one part of the project. I'll probably go next to the coastal panel members. So it's a big project, 400 kilometres, and we've divided it up into 4. And each of those areas have coastal panels. So it's 10 or 12 different community reps. And so we gather the technical information and we make sure that those panels understand the hazards and the risks, and we work with them so that they can help us recommend solutions and pathways. Not just the coastal panels, but also the feedback that we've had from the community thus far, and the feedback that we'll hopefully get tonight and following this presentation as well. So it's worth noting that where we've got to now isn't a final decision on pathways, but it is a point in time that has had quite a lot of feedback and has had quite a lot of consideration of the hazards. So it is significantly progressed. So just lost my train of thought, but going back to who's involved, you've also got a governance committee on top. So we've got a separate committee of council that includes 4 councillors and 4 iwi reps. So that's a good way of getting iwi on board and working in a partnership in terms of that governance approach. The slide here where you see access in the middle, that's a word map. And so early on in the project, we went out and tried to understand what the values were. And some of the things that people thought were important for the project was access. So the state highways are pretty important, but also the environment and the nature and the beaches, particularly on the east coast, are really important, but also Thames and Thames Coast and Tararu as well. So hazards and risk assessments, just an example from Thames, so not Tararu yet. But it's not just the hazard that we think about. We have to look at what's exposed by the hazard and how vulnerable those things are. And after you combine all those things, you start to get an understanding of risk. So the exposure of the hazard probably would affect a building different to would a state highway or a road, and a sports field is probably less vulnerable or more resilient to that type of hazard or exposure. So those type of things are taken into account to understand the risk, and understanding the risk is a key part of the project. So that's a very quick kind of overview of the Shoreline Management Project. Like I said, please use the chat to ask questions, and Connie's going to read them out. Probably a couple of things I haven't mentioned. I've said that it's a 3-year project, and we're actually about 3 or 4 months away from completing the project. So we've got this consultation session. Ideally, this would have been in person, but given the COVID restrictions, we've decided to go online. We're going to go out for another round or a final round of in-person engagement or consultation meetings, hopefully doing that in a month or 2, and then this plan will get recommended to the governance committee for adoption. The plan in itself isn't the end of it. There will be other work required to implement the plan, and probably further analysis and understanding of, or further consultation, understanding of actual costs and things like that as well. So I'll pause there. Connie, are there any questions thus far?
Thanks, Eamon. You've actually answered really the first one, which is just around whether there's going to be a chance for people to join an in-person meeting. So yes, there will be. And the comment that the letter about this meeting tonight has only arrived for some people today, and others are aware of neighbours who didn't know about this meeting. So people just keen to understand any further upcoming opportunities to participate. And then also just wondering who you're looking for feedback from, as this is the first that this person has known about the project as a landowner.
So can you repeat that last one? I didn't quite catch it.
Oh, sorry, feedback from who, as this is the first I have known about this project as a landowner.
Well, definitely feedback from landowners. We have sought feedback quite generally over the past few years, but now we're really focusing in on some of the areas that are most affected by the project. So we've cast the net pretty wide, so we would have had meetings in Thames that covered Tararu and even Te Puru, Kopu, and so we're quite wide in our previous meetings, but now we're being quite focused and talking just about Tararu tonight. Yet last night it was just about Te Puru and other areas over the next couple of weeks, just to make sure that there's an awareness. So we want feedback from you as a landowner, and particularly around what we're showing tonight, but we also want more general feedback, like how important is the state highway? That's a question that kind of covers not just people on the statewide highway. It's a district type question, then district type feedback we're after. Anything else there, Connie?
Yeah, just one further follow-up comment from that person, which you may address as you go on to talk about the hazards. But the question is the hazard water getting into buildings or just across property? As this person has experienced water coming over a couple of times in their 60 years living there, but it only wet the garden, which they don't mind. And in their opinion, and it wasn't near the level that water had arrived on Robert Street. And if that had been an engineered structure, that water wouldn't have entered that property.
Yeah, that's very good comments and questions that we will pick up throughout the presentation. And I'll make sure I explain that as I get to the appropriate slide, which might actually be next. So no, before I get to the slide that talks about hazards, the Tararu details we're going to cover are the hazard assessments, the protection feasibility that we've looked at, and the proposed pathways. So the next part, hopefully, is the hazard. And so Tararu North is shown on the left-hand side, or my left, with the colour map. The photo on the right is probably Tararu South, but this is Tararu North. And in terms of the hazard, just want to explain firstly what a 1% AEP is. A lot of people know, but a lot of people don't. And that is a flood event or a storm event that happens with a 1% chance every year. Statistically, that means it should happen 1 in 100 years, and so often the 1% AEP is also called the 1 in 100 year event, but it doesn't mean you won't get one in the next 10 years or the next 5 years. It's just most likely to happen every 1 in 100 years. So that's a really big event in terms of being infrequent and causes significant amount of flooding or high floodwaters. So there are smaller events, 20-year events, 5-year events, and we have looked at those. There's king tides that can also cause issues. So that's one side of the assessment. The other thing to point out on the map is you've got a legend with a key here. And so the first colour is the light blue. And so that is showing what a 1% AEP would cover when there's 0 sea level rise. So if there was a 1 in 100 year event or a 1% AEP, that's the extent of flooding we would expect as shown on the map in the blue areas. But that extent is only just getting wet. So that doesn't mean that houses or floor levels are flooded. That means that the property, that there's water on the ground. So almost always floor levels are up above the ground. And so you may not get water in your house when you get that event. However, if you go then to 0.2 metres sea level rise, and so the extent shifts inland slightly, but then you can expect the depth of flooding to increase by at least 0.2 metres in the blue area. So it's at that point you'll probably get or start to have the risk of water coming in into above your floor levels. So hopefully that gives some understanding of what the maps show in terms of whether or not they get into the floor levels. As a rule, it doesn't guarantee it's getting into the floor levels, but as the events get larger and depending on how low you are, that does happen. So that's touched on what the hazard or the flood hazard looks like. And the next slide, I think, is about the sea level rise. So also talked about sea level rise and the fact that the maps incorporate sea level rise in 0.2 metre increments. But understanding or knowing when that sea level rise happens has significant amount of uncertainty. And so this graph shows predicted sea level rise over time, and in the near future, it's more certain, I guess, in the period 2040 or out to 2060, you may be looking at 0.2 up to 0.4 metres sea level rise. But as you extend out over to 100 years, there is significant amount of uncertainty, up to 1.4 or 1 point or slightly above, but it could be quite low. So that's the range that's been provided. That said, the recommended approach is to use at least the 8.5. So the scenario that is quite high, and those sea level rise predictions get reviewed and changed quite often. So in the last couple of months, you may have heard about new reports coming out. Those aren't any better than previous than this graph. So this graph is a year or so old, but that newer reports are not making it any better. So it's kind of reinforcing that conservative approach of taking the 8.5 or 8.5 plus scenario. So back to Tararu and the hazards, where we have not just looked at coastal inundation. Flooding is a big part, but also looked at coastal erosion. So coastal erosion is an issue at Tararu. Probably relatively speaking, depending on where you are as well. I mean, if you're got a beachfront property, that might be the bigger issue right now, but generally speaking, the inundation is going to affect Tararu a lot more than the coastal erosion. So those are the two hazards. What we've looked at is coastal hazards. So the coastal hazards of flooding and the coastal hazard of erosion, but we've considered river flooding, but we haven't considered it in a huge amount of detail. And for Tararu, there is existing flood protection for flooding, and I will hand over to Rick just to highlight where that protection is and what that protection does. So, Rick, hopefully you're there.
Yes, thank you, Eamon, and hi again, everyone. So look, I'm sure you all know about the flood protection that you have on the Tararu stream, which is managed by Waikato Regional Council, and you can see it there on the screen. Hopefully you can see my cursor. So you can see the red there are the flood walls that line those areas, and then we have these bunds or stop banks at the ends as well there. So so they are all, Eamon gave a description of a 1% AEP event, and so this flood protection here is for a 1% AEP event, but from flows coming down the creek down the stream there. So they're designed to quite a high standard Can you please do the other slide there? Thank you. And so with that flood protection, that blue area there are areas or properties that have protection from that 1% AEP flow down the creek. So yeah, it provides a good amount of protection, and you may be able to just see that blue line, that sort of a lighter blue line through there, and that was the extent of the impact of the 2002 weather bomb. So that was the, I guess, the initiation for having flood protection works in Tararu. Was the damage caused not just in Tararu, but obviously widespread across the Thames coast from that 2002 event. And I'll probably just leave it there, to be quite honest. And if there are any questions about that flood protection scheme, please put them in the comments and I can answer them. Thank you.
Great. Thanks very much, Rick. I'll probably just make a follow-up comment highlighting the importance that the different agencies do place on working together. Both TCDC and Waikato Regional Council is quite key when there's existing flood protection, but one that stands out here is Waka Kotahi as well. I think the upgrade of that bridge was a significant part of being able to provide that protection. So thinking about protection, what is possible for Tararu is something we've considered as in terms of the project from a technical level, and we've shared this and looked at with the coastal panels to help inform the pathway decision. So it's worth noting that we've looked at it at a very high level. The work that we've done doesn't give us enough to go out and build something. We've provided some consistent bases for design. So we've assumed that a 1%, so that's a 100-year event, is what the protection is required. But we've also assumed that it's required for the 2120 scenario. So that's the sea level rise based on the 8.5 RCP. So it's about 1.4 meters sea level rise. So you could say that this would give you protection for 100 years, and it's conservative in terms of providing that protection. Conservative in terms of design, but I would say that it's probably people have said that it's not conservative in terms of cost. So there could be arguments either way around the cost, but the cost is in the order of $90 million. So it's a huge cost, but that is not what we would be advocating to provide now or possibly even in the future. And it is a design that is not required now. So that has been looked at in terms of at a high level to understand what that height and what it might look like. You're looking at a height of probably 2 or 3 meters around that length of Tararu. Just going back to the picture on the right, in some areas you'd be able to provide, or we'd be able to provide a stop bank or a bunt, and that's the blue areas that are shown. But in some areas there's not a lot of room, so actually walls would be required. And I think there was a comment about the existing flood protection walls. These would be engineered walls that would provide a more assured level of service, the same way that the Waikato Regional Council flood protection does. So that's interesting to look at. It's good to know it's possible to protect. It doesn't seem like it's affordable, and it's not actually what we need to provide now. But it is good in terms of guiding our thinking and understanding of what would be required in the very long term. The design parameters we've set in place, we've done in a consistent way. So across the district, I think we've got 8 or 9 locations where we've looked at what would be required to protect different areas. So hopefully remember them all, but Thames, Tararu, Tararu, Colville, Whitianga, Tararu, and I think we've done a little bit of work on Whangamata, or a small part of Whangamata. So hopefully there may be some questions now, Connie.
Sure, thanks, Eamon. And just a reminder to everyone that we are recording and saving the chat in here. So if you have feedback and comments as Eamon is talking, feel free to just leave them in the chat thread as feedback, and then any questions as well we will ask so that you can get a response while you're here tonight. We have one question, Eamon, asking, will the council eventually look at resettlement for low-lying properties?
Resettlement, we haven't gone that far in understanding how you might want to approach managed retreat or planned retreat. Resettlement could be something that's on the table, because we haven't looked at it in any detail. We haven't excluded things, so there are plenty of options to be thought about. I'll probably touch on what I think is the range of options if you are thinking about resettlement or planning retreat. One is to make sure that the information around the hazards is known. So that's something we're kind of doing now, and we make sure that the hazard maps are available. That allows people to make informed choices about the risks. So if they haven't actually experienced a flood event, at least they know what they're getting into by living there. They could make their own choices on not rebuilding after a flood event, or that starts to go a step further. You may have insurance challenges, and so that might encourage people not to rebuild. Or another step further, you could look at purchasing property. So an entity, either a council or a central government, could look at purchasing property, something that's been talked about in different parts of New Zealand, so Hawke's Bay and Kaiawa, not in terms of able to implement it, but the idea of purchasing properties and leasing them back to landowners. So if the risk is okay for 50 years, you could purchase the property, an entity could, you could lease it back so that people have assurance that the location is okay for a set period of time, but after that time, there'd be a need to relocate. So, and then going through to the extreme, you'd try and put planning in place to if the hazard was so great, people's lives are at risk, you'd try and strongly encourage them to move away, I think. But I don't think we're at that point, and even looking into the future, hope we don't get there as well. Other questions, Connie?
Can you please explain what you mean by managed or planned retreat?
Yes, I tried to explain that there is a range of how planned retreat would work, and so we haven't done the work to say planned retreat should be A, B, or C, and it will be quite specific to each location. So I probably can't elaborate more other than saying that there's the option of very little input from a council or an entity, so that the hazards and people make their own choices about living in the risk area, through to purchasing property and putting planning aspects in place. So there's a real range of what planned retreat might be, and we haven't done the work to say this is what's appropriate to use here or appropriate to use in other places.
Thanks, Eamon. We do have a couple of questions about the sea level rise modelling that's being used. And one of them is the sea level the same height as HDC is using for Kaiawa, and what Bay of Plenty and Auckland have used?
Eamon, I can answer that. Rick here from Regional Council. So the levels used for the Thames-Coromandel have been derived by Royal Haskoning, and they are slightly different but very similar to what was used for the Kaiawa coastline, the Wharekawa coastwork as well. The levels are different to Auckland, if I understand the question correctly, because they are significantly different places, and so that the tidal regime differs between the southern Firth of Thames and within Auckland.
Thanks, Rick. And are you still able to hear me through my laptop?
Yes.
Yes.
Good. Bit worried about that. And probably the other thing, just the flood or the storm event levels are different, but without knowing definitely for sure, but the sea level rise scenarios are probably the same because it's what's been recommended through the MFE guidance.
Just another question on sea level rise, Eamon. Have you checked actual rise versus these prediction models? NIWA recently has done a report showing 2 millimetres, I believe, they'd have to check that. So over the time frame, the actual rise perhaps only 20 odd millimetres, and your prediction is 100 millimetres plus. So you are using prediction models that is not tracking to those levels to make decisions.
Yeah, so we're using what's recommended. We have looked at those measurements. Sian or Rick want to explain a bit more about actual measurements to predicted measurements? Is there anything you guys want to add to that?
Yeah, I can, Eamon. Sorry, I think there's an echo. That's better. So we based the modelling on the scenarios that are recommended by the Ministry for the Environment, so the rates of sea level rise that Eamon showed you earlier. In terms of storm events and the information we use to predict the size of wave setup and the storm surge, we've looked at actual storm events that have affected the Thames coast in the past and used that information. So we looked and used the January 2018 storm event and looked at what happened there. But coming back to your point about actual measured sea level rise, you're right, it is 2 millimetres that's been measured so far. Unfortunately, the predictions are that that rate of change is going to accelerate. So you don't expect it to remain at 2 millimetres a year into the foreseeable future, and certainly not over a 100-year scenario. So it's expected to ramp up. Having said that, and Eamon will show you this shortly, what we're doing in terms of our strategy is we're not saying we're going to make decisions based on these predictions and the model data. We're saying that we're going to measure actual change, and we've set trigger points that are based on actual levels of water being achieved. So if sea level only rises by 2 millimetres a year for the next 20, 30 years, actually very little will need to change. But if it does accelerate, then we'll have our plan in place in terms of what we need to do. Thanks, Eamon.
Thank you, Sian. That's a really good lead into the kind of next slides. But before I do, any more questions, Connie?
Just one question asking if it's possible to be emailed the slides from tonight, and yes, they will be publicly available. And that's a good reminder that if we haven't answered your question or you haven't had a chance to discuss in detail what you would like to tonight, to please do send us an email, and I'll type that now into the chat thread so everybody can see that email address.
Thank you, Connie. So this is, in a way, the culmination of all the work that's been done over the couple of years. We've got the hazard maps on the left-hand side showing the inundation and the erosion, and then we've got pathways. So there's a little bit to get your head around the pathways. And just in terms of the inundation, I'll talk about the pathways that affect an inundation aspect to start with. And so very soon, we recommend
or this is what the project is recommending, and open to feedback. And that's why we're here, to get feedback from you today and in other forms. But we're recommending to improve the existing defences. So we acknowledge that there are some defences, but they're not comprehensive in terms of the area. So they probably not to consistent standard either. So for the short term, the recommendation is to protect the area and improve the existing defences. Once you get to a point in time, and what we're saying here is that's 0.4 metres of sea level rise, we think you should start to transition away from protection and look to relocate hazard affected properties. And so just want to acknowledge that that aspect can be quite confronting and quite an issue for people in the area. And so the Coastal Panel definitely recognises that as well, and it's been an aspect of consideration throughout the process, the impact on various people living in this area. The reason why we're recommending, or likely to recommend, at 0.4 you transition away is because at 0.6 we don't think it would be a good place to be in terms of the flood depth in an event would be more than half the area, and it could be above 0.5 metres. So that would be definitely well above the floor levels and cause significant damage to homes. And I pause there because when I say homes, not all homes are at the same level or will be impacted by the hazard in the same way. So if you can see the hazard map, the blue areas are generally the lower areas that have the most risk. And as you work up in terms of the colours, until purple is probably the 1.4 metre sea level rise. And so at 1.4 metres sea level rise and an extreme 100-year event, the property may be getting wet. But if there's any elevation on the floor levels, those floor levels would actually be relatively unaffected by that extreme event. So just to kind of highlight from a flood perspective, improving the defences is what we think is appropriate in the medium term, and then moving in the longer term to the relocation. There's a couple of notes on timeframes. So these timeframes are basically we look at the predicted sea level rise, what does 0.2 line up with in terms of the MFE guidance, and these are the years down the side here. So for 0.2, it's 24 years, 0.2, 43, and 0.6, I'm pretty sure that's 57. So like Sian said, if we don't get to 0.2 or the rate of sea level rise continues at the current rate, we may only ever get to 0.2 or never get to 0.6. That would be ideal, or it may take twice as long to reach 0.6. If that happens, that's great, and we don't have to think about relocating houses or properties, but we are planning for the worst and hoping for the best. Alongside that, we also recognise the hazard of coastal erosion, and we've got sediment recycling as a key thing there. Sediment recycling only goes for a set period of time because improving defences may also help address the coastal erosion issue. So if you think back to the cross-section we showed, actually armouring the inundation or the flood protection would help with the erosion protection as well. So that's Tararu North, and that's slightly easier to get your head around. I'll ask if there's any questions now before I go to the next one where we start including the state highway. But Anything yet, Connie, in terms of questions?
Sure. Oh, I can hear an echo, sorry. I'm confused, says this person. You said this was a consultation for comment, but you've already decided point 4 as the trigger. Who decided this, as this person believes it should be those that would pay for it?
So we haven't decided. This is what's been recommended. In terms of how we've got to point 4, that's been a process with the coastal panel. So it's not just the hazard map you see in front of you. There's also another layer of analysis. So we don't just look at the extreme 100-year event. We also look at the 20-year event, and some of the consideration has been, well, how frequent would that 20, so basically a 100-year event starts to become a 20-year event after so much sea level rise. So the coastal panel, supported by the technical team, has come to suggest these trigger points. The other important aspect is the community, which we've had feedback from, but not specific local feedback, or not much specific local feedback on whether point 4 is right for Tararu. And that's exactly what we're here to listen to. If accepting more risk and not initiating existing holding off from relocation and for longer, we want to hear that if that's the view. I will jump to the next slide and then just come back to the questions. So similar approach, or the same approach on this slide in terms of the southern part of Tararu, but complicated because there's also the aspect of the state highway. So throughout the various scenarios, we recognise that the state highways are a key transport route, and that should be raised and protected. So that's a consistent recommendation out through to the long term. That doesn't mean that it will be raised to a 100-year level of protection, though. Discussions with the coastal panel, depending on the specifics of the state highway, and this is one that's more important than others, people can live with a road being closed once a year. So if there's you don't need to have it protected in theory to not be closed every 100 years or every 50 years, and often through discussions it's acceptable for a road to be closed once a year or every 2 years for a couple of hours. What's not acceptable is for it to be washed away. So there's a bit of a difference between protecting the road from damage and protecting it from ever getting wet. So a couple of other slight differences. I think there is an acknowledgement that there is gaps in this area in terms of water being able to get through, and so that's in there. But apart from that, quite similar to the Tararu North area. So more questions, Connie?
We do have a comment that relates to the feasibility of the defence option. This person says, have you not seen the stop banks out in Aotea or in the Netherlands where they can build up to 7 metres high, but you're not able to build one to 600 millimetres? Either put a breakwater or top up the bunds that are already there. Have you visited Tararu, or did any of you see the 2018 event? You've said that you've used actual levels, which was 2.8 on the 5th of January in 2018, which was the highest ever level recorded, which includes wave run up and set up, and it had minimal effect on Tararu, as only a swell coming down the Firth.
Just trying to think back to the actual questions. Yes, we have visited Tararu plenty of times. I think the first time I remember was 2002. I was with someone called Ian Sarah, a work supervisor, and there was a flood event that we'd gone to look at shortly after, just to understand the damage that flooding caused. So yeah, I've been there a lot in terms of understanding the stop banks and the hydrographic planes. Myself and the wider project team have. I think there may have been, you said 60 millimetres in there. I think what we talked about is a protection up to six metres. And so what the feasibility study has said is it is possible. It is possible to build things that high, but it's also very expensive. And given that there's a relatively small direct beneficiaries that might need to pay for an expensive protection, we don't think at this stage that it would be affordable. So that's one aspect of why it's not recommended for kind of 100+ years. But that's also the type of feedback we want to hear. If it is protect and we're willing to pay, or we want support paying, and protection is what we desire more than anything else, that's what we want to hear as well.
Thanks, Eamon. We do have another question. How frequently would 1% AEP events be projected to occur with 0.2 metres and 0.4 metres of sea level rise?
I don't have that with me unless one of my team has that at their fingertips. I don't know if Rick has a real good statistics at hand.
I do, and I'm just going to reply to that with an image. So while we don't, we can infer of that 0.2 and 0.4. However, and that graph might be a little bit small for people to read, but if we look at the event that occurred in 2018, and so we had around about a 2.62 tide at the Tararu tide gauge. So when it refers to Tararu, it's Tararu tide gauge. And if you look at it's a log scale on the bottom there. If we had 0.3 meters of sea level rise over a 10-year period, we're getting close to 1 every 10 years. But then if we have another 0.2, so we get a total of 0.5 meters of sea level rise, that level that we saw in 2018, it's predicted or projected to have that occurring almost every year over a 10-year period. So getting close to 10 of those events that we saw in 2018 over a 10-year monitoring period. So the frequency definitely does increase with sea level rise.
Thanks, Rick. And that's something that we've talked through with the coastal panels and have gathered an understanding of. Just don't have all the statistics like Rick does at my fingertips. So thanks very much, Rick. Any more questions, Colleen?
A query about whether we can please provide a list of the technical people who have reviewed and believe the levels that we are speaking about are correct.
Yes, we can. And Sian, did you want to add comments on the peer review process?
Yeah, so the modelling work's been quite comprehensively reviewed. It's been reviewed with Waikato by Waikato Regional Council, but they have also sent it out to specialists at NIWA and at the University of Auckland, who've provided us with quite robust feedback on the rates of sea level rise, on the wave setup conditions, and the modelling that's been done.
And there's quite, as we get to the end, I'll show you quite quickly where a lot of the information, or almost all the information on the project, is stored on our Shoreline Management Plan website. So I'll point you in the direction of where to get more information and find various reports.
Thanks, Eamon. A question about whether if this will affect our rates, and will that mean we cease to pay Environment Waikato as this does not help us?
If we were to build protection, it is likely that there would be a rating cost associated with the protection provided to the area. So in terms of affecting rates, yes, from a protection point of view. In terms of not having to pay Waikato Regional Council rates, I would say that the service that they're providing is still there and is still valid, because there is a risk of river flooding that you're still being protected against. So you're protected currently from river flooding, but this is a slightly different hazard in terms of coastal flooding. I wouldn't want to speculate more on the WRC rating on its impacts, though.
Thanks, Eamon. And just one further comment around costs. This person saying that they had spoken to Ian and he believed that the structure costs could be done for less than 2 million.
That would be fantastic. And as we look to even in the short term, if the proposed pathways are followed as shown, we would do more investigation on the costs. What we haven't looked at is the cost of a staged or a lower kind of level of service. So not a 100-year event in 100 years' time, perhaps a 20-year event that is valid for the next 10 or 20 years. Would be at a lot lower level and at a lot lower cost. We haven't costed up all the various scenarios. Ian's costs are probably referenced back in terms of when he'd built things personally, and so they may have crept up in terms of what he's thinking. But yeah, that would be great if we could do it for less, and we would look at it before we actually started implementing things, and would talk about the costs and who would need to pay and the rating impacts as well.
That's great. Thanks, Eamon. We do have further comments from that person, but I'm just aware of the time, and would encourage them to please use the email address and the feedback tool that Eamon will take you through shortly, if you'd like to have a more detailed conversation with anybody in the team.
Thanks very much, Connie.
That's all the questions we have now. Thanks, Eamon.
Great. So it sounds like I've been following the chat, but it sounds like there's some good feedback that we can pick up on. There's the email address, that's ourcoast@tcdc.govt.nz. Connie may have already provided that. And then I'm going to try to probably have to share my screen slightly differently, show you our website so that you get an understanding of where to go for additional information. Oh, that's not it. Bear with me, sorry. Just share the full screen. There we are. That's pretty close. So at the top, tcdc.govt.nz/SMP. All the information about our meetings that we're having now and over the next few days with different communities are on there. That's kind of the focus of what we're doing next. So the things that are the focus kind of come up the top of this page. Just below that is the feedback tool, which I'll ask Sian to show us very quickly. But along the side is all the adaptation posters and the hazard maps. There's information on who does what in the coastal environment. So that's understanding, giving insight into the difference between Regional Council and TCDC. And I talked a little bit about it. That's a video you can see there that explains or gives some insight into the engagement we've done already. And then just coming down, I want to find the link, and the link is for understanding the different return periods. So where you've got 1% or a 5% event.
It's there, Amon.
It's right here.
Yeah, under important additional resources.
Yes.
Yeah.
Should. So one of the reasons I wanted to just point it out is it isn't actually easy to find, and that's because there is a lot of information. So it's and our most current information gets a focus. But if you wanted to know some of those things about what a 20-year event looks like under different sea level rise scenarios, that's the button to push, and you can get both 20-year and king tide event information as well. They're right across the district, but definitely for Tararu, and there will be more information that gets put on here. So that's all about the website, apart from handing over to Sian just to take you through the feedback tool. And I'll stop sharing my screen.
Hi, okay. So Amon showed you the website. I'll actually just click back to that. And on the website, there's this piece here that says once you've attended a meeting, you can provide feedback by clicking on this link. Now that link takes you through to this page here, and it's a consultation tool that's online, and there's a home page which just explains really how it works, provides background to the project and some prompting questions, and gives you instructions on how you can leave and add a comment. But really the key to that is if you go across to the map, just repeat the information, the instructions on how to leave a comment, which you can click through, and then it takes you to a map of the Coromandel. You can see on this version here, so this is the current version of it, those little arrows, I guess, that's where people have left comments to date on different parts of the coast. So you can see we've actually been receiving some feedback in the last few days since the meetings we've been having. If you zoom in, you can actually see the comments. So I've zoomed in here to the part of the coast that we're talking about. And that there's a couple of 3 comments here on Moanatari. We had a meeting there on Monday. That's talking about the fact it's reclaimed land and the school needs to be protected and so on. You click on the stretch of coast you're interested in, so click on here for Tararu South, and it provides on the left-hand side the information about that area and gives you a link to the poster. You can then click on that and it gives you a large version of the poster, so you can look at this information in more detail and actually it sort of examine the pathway that is proposed and that we want you to comment on and we want to have feedback on. So going back to the map then, to leave a comment, as I said, you go to the stretch of coast you're interested in, and there's a little click on that, and there's a box here that says add comment. Click on add comment, and as I said, the instructions are there, add a new feature, and away you go. And you can put that arrow wherever you want. You click on the coast and you put in your comment. And those comments, everyone will be able to see them. And we will take account of that information. And where questions are asked, we will respond to those. And as everyone said, you can also use the Our Coast email address that's been put in the chat to ask questions of us as well. That's how it works. Thank you.
Thank you, Sian. some good feedback there. As this tool kind of highlights, this is a district-wide project. There's 400 kilometres. Tararu is an important area, as is Tararu and other areas up the coast. There will be other iterations of discussion. The adoption of the plan starts to set a strategic direction on what we should focus on. So if that interim protection in the short term is highly desired and thought a good idea by the community, we want to hear that. We also want to hear information about triggers, the ability to live with risk. Perhaps one of them might interpret as if it's not affecting the floor levels, and I think it was in the comment that getting your gardens wet doesn't actually matter too much. So that's good. That type of feedback is really good. So without anything else to add from me, we do plan on coming back to have in-person meetings. There'll be another iteration or edits to these pathways based on feedback we receive before they get finalised or recommended to council for adoption. Thank you everyone for taking time out tonight and contributing to the process. Hope to meet some of you in person. Hopefully the COVID restrictions just fade away over the next wee while and we can come and see you in person. So good night everyone. Thank you. See you next time.